The morning of June 16, 1944, was a brutal dawn of steel and screams on Saipan. Offshore, the invasion fleet provided an endless, thundering base to the close-quarters fighting. But down on the beach, in the bloody sand and splintered palm trees, the sound that mattered most was the rapid, metallic clamor of a light-caliber automatic weapon. This sound was the .50-caliber Browning M2 heavy machine gun, and it was rewriting the rules of tank warfare in the Pacific. In the pre-dawn darkness, Colonel Takashi Goto's 9th Tank Regiment had launched the largest armored counterattack the Americans had yet faced in the island-hopping campaign. 44 tanks, a mix of the slightly larger Type 97 Chiha and the smaller, faster Type 95 Hago, were charging toward the American beachhead. Inside the cramped, hot hole of his Type 95, a tank commander, perhaps Lieutenant Kenji Okamura, would have felt the familiar, confident rattle of his tank. He would have heard the powerful drone of the air-cooled diesel engine, the noise a lullaby of war he had trusted for years. He had fought in China, where his 12mm armor shrugged off rifle fire like rain. He had heard the stories from Malaya where his tanks had surprised and overwhelmed the unprepared British. He was fighting for the Emperor, and his tank was the shield of his courage. But then the world outside the small, narrow vision slot changed. The Americans had not panicked. They had not fled. Instead, they answered the Japanese charge with a deafening and sustained volley of fire from weapons that were not supposed to be anti-tank guns. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese commander saw the flashes, felt the tremendous, sharp impacts, but these were different from the dull, harmless thud of small arms fire. He knew. These impacts were followed by a high-pitched whine and the sickening smell of shrapnel and burning hydraulic fluid. Suddenly, the noise wasn't just on the outside, it was inside. A bright, silver-hot projectile had pierced the thin armor plate of the turret front, passing so close to his head that he felt the displacement of air. His gunner screamed, falling back onto the small, cluttered floor of the fighting compartment. The Japanese commander looked down and saw a clean, circular hole in the armor plate, where there should only have been a dent. Outside, the .50-caliber machine guns continued their rhythmic, unforgiving boom-boom-boom. The tank slowed, then swerved, its tracks losing traction as the transmission seized. The commander found himself staring at the impossible reality of the battle. His tank, his trusted shield, his home in war, was being systematically destroyed by a heavy machine gun. The weapon was not artillery. It was not a specialized tank destroyer. It was an infantry support weapon, a gun typically mounted on a jeep or a half-track. The question that would haunt every surviving Japanese tanker for the rest of the war was simple and devastating. How could a machine gun bullet kill a tank? The answer lay in a secret the Americans possessed, a secret built not of magic but of steel, molybdenum, and industrial power. The commander's life was ending not in glorious combat, but in the realization of a colossal, unforgivable engineering failure. The conflict that engulfed the Pacific was a war defined by the vast, almost incomprehensible differences in industrial capacity between the United States and Japan. This disparity was not merely a matter of quantity but of design philosophy, and it was this philosophy that led directly to the vulnerability of the Type 95 Hago. The Hago was born in 1933 from military specifications that reflected the Japanese Army's strategic realities at the time. The Imperial Army was focused on campaigns in Manchuria and China, regions characterized by poor roads, vast distances, and an enemy that possessed almost no armor and few dedicated anti-tank weapons. The primary role of the new tank was not to fight other tanks, but to support infantry breakthroughs, exploit weak points in the line, and outmaneuver the enemy across difficult terrain. Mobility, reliability, and ease of maintenance were paramount. The design priorities were crystal clear. The tank had to be light enough, around 7.4 tons, to be easily transported across the limited infrastructure of the Japanese Empire, and to be highly mobile in soft ground. This emphasis on mobility over protection was a calculated trade-off. The designers determined that 12 millimeters of armor, roughly half an inch, at its thickest points on the turret and upper hull would be sufficient to withstand the rifle and standard machine gun fire of the Chinese National Revolutionary Army. Against the enemy they were designed to fight, the tank was a technological wonder. Its 37-millimeter gun could punch through fortifications, and its reliable Mitsubishi air-cooled diesel engine made it less prone to fire than gasoline-powered counterparts. The Type 95 was perfectly adequate for the war it was designed for, the war that began in 1937. However, the war had changed drastically. Japan's decision to attack the United States meant their tanks would face an opponent whose design philosophy was the antithesis of their own. American engineers valued protection and overwhelming firepower above all else, driven by an industrial base capable of producing limitless quantities of steel and massive engines. Furthermore, the Americans designed every piece of equipment, down to the smallest machine gun round, with strategic redundancy. The heavy machine gun was not just for infantry suppression. It was a multi-role weapon designed to pierce the aluminum skin of aircraft and defeat the light armor of vehicles and pillboxes. The standard ammunition load for the .50 caliber Browning M2 included an armor-piercing AP round. This projectile, made of hardened, dense steel alloy and fired at a velocity of over 2,900 feet per second, carried a staggering amount of kinetic energy. The American Ordnance Board had calculated that this AP round could cleanly penetrate 23 millimeters of face-hardened steel armor at a range of 200 yards. This was nearly twice the thickness of the Hago's maximum 12-millimeter armor. The great irony was that the Japanese tank, designed years before the United States entered the war, had been inadvertently engineered with a precise fatal vulnerability to the most common American heavy weapon. The engineers in Tokyo had built a 7-ton vehicle that could be defeated by a single infantry support bullet. The psychological narrative woven around the Japanese soldier was inextricably tied to this material reality, yet deliberately divorced from it. The military leadership could not openly admit their technological inferiority. Instead, they doubled down on the concept of spiritual superiority, a core principle known as gyakusai. This doctrine, which translated roughly to honorable suicide or to shatter like a jewel, became the defining psychological contract between the soldier and the emperor. It stated that true Japanese courage, Yamato Damashi, would triumph over the American flood of steel, gasoline, and materiel. The soldier was indoctrinated to believe that American abundance was a weakness, a sign of spiritual softness and reliance on mere things. His own willingness to fight without food, without adequate medicine, and ultimately without protection, was the hallmark of his superiority. This meant that the failure of his equipment was simply a test of his resolve, not a design flaw. For the tank crews of the 9th Regiment, this meant believing their Hagos, which were already obsolete by 1944, were still sufficient because the spirit of the crew was stronger than the American shell. They were fighting an emotional war built on nationalist zeal and a cultivated contempt for the enemy's wealth. Crucially, the same propaganda that exaggerated Japanese capabilities also drastically misrepresented American forces. The enemy was portrayed not as highly disciplined professional soldiers, but as effeminate, cowardly conscripts who would break and run when faced with a determined banzai charge. This elaborate psychological framework completely collapsed under the weight of 23 millimeters of penetration power. The Japanese tank crew charging across the fields of Saipan in the pre-dawn hours of June 17th was not merely fighting the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions. They were fighting the American Industrial Revolution, embodied in a 50 caliber machine gun round. When the 12 millimeter armor, their sacred shield, failed to stop a bullet that was not even designed as the primary anti-tank measure, the entire spiritual edifice came crashing down. The physical hole in the armor created an irreparable psychological breach. They were not fighting men who fled. They were fighting men who had so much surplus firepower that their infantry support weapons could destroy a tank. The psychological shift was not about accepting defeat, but about the dawning, terrifying realization of betrayal. Their leaders had sent them to die in a machine that offered no protection against the enemy's most common heavy weapon, while simultaneously teaching them that death was the only honorable outcome. The final irony was that the most spiritual of weapons, the self-sacrificial charge, was rendered meaningless by the most material of objects, a single mass-produced, steel-jacketed bullet. The Japanese High Command, despite its zealous promotion of spiritual purity, was not entirely blind to the need for material protection. Their tank designs incorporated a crucial, flawed feature based on an outdated assumption: the use of face-hardened armor. Face hardening is a metallurgical process where the exterior layer of a steel plate is heated and rapidly cooled, making the surface extremely hard while the inner core remains relatively soft. The theory, derived from experiences in the Sino-Japanese War, was that this hardened surface would cause lower velocity, soft-core enemy rifle and machine gun bullets to shatter upon impact or deflect sharply, preventing penetration. This technique worked perfectly against the standard 30 caliber weapons and non-armor-piercing ammunition typical of the Chinese armies. The Japanese tankers learned to trust the audible clack of a bullet harmlessly deflecting off their armor. However, the American 50 caliber armor-piercing AP round completely negated this defense. The M2 AP round, with its hardened molybdenum steel core encased in a copper jacket, did not rely on shattering or deflection. It was a high-velocity kinetic penetrator. When this round struck the Hago's 12 millimeter armor, the intense, focused energy of the projectile easily bypassed the hardened surface layer, often punching through the plate without deforming significantly. The result was a clean 12.7 millimeter entry hole, followed by a spray of molten metal and high-velocity spall inside the cramped crew compartment, a deadly secondary fragmentation that did as much damage as the round itself. The sheer scale of the American commitment to war materiel further exacerbated the situation. By 1944, the United States was producing 50 caliber machine guns at a rate of tens of thousands per month. The weapon was ubiquitous, mounted not just on the turrets of M4 Sherman tanks and the anti-aircraft rings of half-tracks, but on simple jeeps and deployed as standard heavy infantry support throughout the Marine rifle. Companies. The Japanese, whose own industrial output was in free fall, could only produce a trickle of their own meager heavy weapons, like the Type 1 47 millimeter anti-tank gun, which was quickly becoming obsolete. The statistical comparison was a death sentence. The Detroit tank arsenal alone, by 1943, was producing more tanks in a single month than the entire Japanese war machine produced in the last 2 years of the conflict. The American soldier was, quite literally, drowning the Japanese in steel, a truth the Imperial General Headquarters consciously withheld from its men. The Japanese tanker was sent to fight a war of 1937 technology against a mass-produced weapon whose design parameters were already optimized for the industrial conflict of 1944. The final catastrophic collision of these two divergent worlds occurred at 0330 hours on June 17, 1944, during the Battle of Saipan. Colonel Goto's armored charge was designed to exploit the darkness and the still-forming gaps in the Marine beachhead. The tanks rolled forward, diesel engines thundering through the quiet tropical night, followed by waves of screaming Japanese infantry. For the tankers, this was the moment of truth, the culmination of their spiritual training. But for the Marines of the 6th Regiment, 2nd Marine Division, it was an expected, calculated challenge. Their perimeter defenses were not reliant solely on the 37mm anti-tank guns or the newly arrived Sherman tanks. They were anchored by the ubiquitous 50-caliber machine guns. As the dark shapes of the Hagos and Chihas emerged from the north, Marine machine gunners, many of them trained in the vehicle maintenance battalions before being pressed into infantry roles, opened up with sustained, deliberate fire. A Marine corporal named Jimmy C. Pogue, manning a 50 caliber on a stationary mount, later recounted his disbelief as he watched his tracer rounds, bright, burning dots marking the trajectory of the AP rounds, impact directly on the front plate of an advancing Hago. He saw the flash of the strike, but instead of the round deflecting, he immediately saw sparks inside the tank through the vision port, a sure sign of penetration. The Japanese crew experienced a sudden, disorienting nightmare. The interior of the tank was filled with a high-velocity metallic rain. The air was heavy with the smell of vaporized steel and blood. Crew members, including the radio operator or hull gunner, suddenly collapsed, not from a massive anti-tank shell, but from a wound caused by what they believed to be merely a large machine gun. The Hagos were designed to be tough against infantry. Their greatest weakness was that they were paper-thin against the infantry's heavy support weapons. One Hago, struck multiple times on its thin 9mm engine deck armor, seized up entirely as AP rounds destroyed the delicate components of the Mitsubishi engine. The tank became an immobile coffin. When the commander, confused and terrified, threw open his cupola hatch to assess the damage, he exposed himself to the concentrated rifle fire from the Marine perimeter. Another tank commander, whose turret traverse had been jammed by a .50 caliber hit, frantically ordered his gunner to fire the 37mm main gun at the muzzle flash of a distant Sherman. The small round struck the Sherman's frontal glacis plate, which was protected by over 51mm of angled armor. The shell merely left a small, insignificant dent, a puff of smoke, before the Sherman replied with a single devastating 75mm high-explosive round, blowing the Hago's turret clean off the chassis. The belief in spirit shattered instantly, consumed by the overwhelming, undeniable material reality of the enemy's firepower. 31 Japanese tanks were destroyed in that single counterattack, a crushing final lesson written in the language of American steel. The aftermath of the Saipan tank charge was the ultimate moment of realization, a chillingly detailed exhibition of technological disparity that confirmed the psychological shift. As the sun fully rose over the battlefield, Marines walked the perimeter, inspecting the wreckage. What they found solidified the new casual contempt for Japanese armor. The tanks were not mangled messes left by high-explosive artillery. Many were riddled with the signature wounds of the .50 caliber AP round. An American officer famously called his men over to a disabled Hago, pointing to the clean, punched-out holes in the 12mm side armor. The Marine infantrymen, who had once harbored a healthy fear of enemy armor, were now laughing. The great Japanese tank was, structurally, no more formidable than an armored truck. Inside the destroyed Hagos, the gruesome effects of spalling and penetration were evident. The cramped interiors offered no protection. A round entering the left side of the hull often exited the right, leaving a trail of destruction through the engine and the crew compartments. Captured Japanese tank crewmen, bewildered and in shock, were often the most valuable sources of intelligence, not because of their tactical knowledge, but because their internal world had been irrevocably shattered. Interrogators noted a consistent, almost childlike confusion. The Japanese tankers had been told to fear the American spirit, the ruthlessness and cunning of the enemy. Instead, they had faced an impersonal, industrial efficiency that annihilated their armor with its most common heavy weapon. They could process the power of a 75mm Sherman gun, but the betrayal by the .50 caliber machine gun was the profound personal shock. They had trusted their tanks, built on the premise that they could withstand infantry fire. The Americans, however, had produced a machine gun that made that premise a fatal lie. The final irony was codified in the military doctrine that followed. Word spread through the Marine and Army ranks quickly. Don't waste the bazooka on a Hago. The .50 cal will do the job. Japanese armor ceased to be a major threat and became a standard target for infantry support weapons. The fear was gone. The enemy's equipment was obsolete. The psychological contract was broken. For the surviving Japanese tankers, the war had transitioned from a spiritual crusade to a simple, hopeless waiting game. They knew that their spirit could not repel a bullet made of molybdenum steel, and that their remaining tanks were merely transportation to a guaranteed fiery death. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological and material truth revealed on Saipan had immediate, tangible consequences that rippled through the rest of the Pacific War. For the American forces, particularly the Marine Corps, the discovery of the Hago's fatal flaw fundamentally altered their tactical approach to Japanese armor for every subsequent island campaign. Before Saipan, Japanese tanks, though few in number, carried a disproportionate amount of fear. A tank, regardless of its thickness, represented a psychological threat, a breakthrough weapon that could demoralize infantry and disrupt defensive lines. After Saipan, that fear evaporated. The message that spread through the ranks was simple and actionable. Japanese armor was obsolete and vulnerable to standard infantry support weapons. This wasn't merely morale boosting, it was a shift in doctrine. Marine units no longer had to rely solely on the limited supply of specialized anti-tank weapons, like the bazooka rocket launcher or the cumbersome aging 37mm anti-tank gun. Instead, they knew that every .50 caliber Browning M2, a weapon widely available across every perimeter, vehicle, and even on ad hoc emplacements, was an effective tank killer. This knowledge provided immense tactical flexibility. When Japanese tank attacks came later on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, they were often met with overwhelming, precise fire that disabled their mobility or killed the crew inside their vehicle before they could get into close range. The .50 caliber machine gun became the unsung hero of the anti-tank battle. Its high rate of fire and penetrating power meant that if the initial rounds didn't destroy the engine or wound the crew, the sustained bursts would quickly jam the delicate turret mechanisms or punch through the thinner armor around hatches and vision ports. The material superiority of the molybdenum steel AP round had rendered the Japanese tanker's most basic defense, the illusion of security, non-existent. The Japanese strategy of using tanks for swift, shocking breakthroughs was permanently neutralized because the American infantry refused to be shocked. They simply engaged their heavy machine guns. This saved countless American lives and reduced the time required to neutralize armored threats, speeding the grim timetable of the island invasions. For the surviving Japanese tank crews and the military command, the legacy of Saipan was one of betrayal and resignation. The Japanese General Staff could not afford to widely publicize the technical defeat of their most modern, widely produced tank. To admit that their equipment was being defeated by a machine gun would have shattered the entire doctrine of spiritual superiority they had carefully cultivated. They continued to send the obsolete Type 95 Hagos and Type 97 Chihas to the Pacific battlefields simply because they had nothing else to send. Japan's industrial capacity had already been decisively crushed. While American factories were churning out thousands of the vastly superior M4 Sherman tank, a 30-ton machine with a 75mm gun and angled armor that could shrug off the Japanese 37mm round. Japanese priority had entirely shifted away from armor. Steel and engineers were directed toward building aircraft for the desperate kamikaze program and manufacturing coastal defense artillery for the anticipated invasion of the home island. Better tank designs, such as the Type 3 Chinu with a 75mm gun, were developed, but fewer than 170 were ever produced, and none saw combat outside of Japan. They were held back for the final defense, ensuring that the soldiers fighting on islands like Guam and Peleliu were equipped only with the war's worst secrets. The psychological impact on the Japanese tank crews who did survive battles like Saipan was profound. They had been indoctrinated to believe that death was a spiritual choice, an act of supreme honor. but the experience of having their tank penetrated by a common heavy machine gun stripped the romance from their sacrifice. They were no longer the vanguard of the Emperor's spirit. They were simply disposable meat in thin steel cans. This realization, documented in post-war interviews and analyses, contributed to a deep, underlying cynicism among the veteran units. The shame was not in the loss of the battle, but in the realization that their leaders had lied about the basic capabilities of their equipment. The final act of defiance became less about a glorious charge and more about a desperate final attempt to delay the inevitable. The Hago, the once proud symbol of imperial mobility, became the material monument to Japan's utter failure to transition from the limited conflicts of the 1930s to the high-intensity industrial warfare of the 1940s. The small specific story of the 50 caliber bullet and the Type 95 Hago tank provides a crucial lens through which to view the overall narrative of the Pacific War. It was a conflict decided not just by grand strategy or individual bravery, but by metallurgy, logistics, and production rates. The psychological shift experienced by the Japanese tankers, from confident zealots to disillusioned victims of industrial disparity, serves as a powerful metaphor for Japan's ultimate defeat. They were undone by the sheer, overwhelming redundancy of American firepower. The United States had so much material wealth that the weapons designed to fight aircraft and light vehicles possessed enough kinetic energy to destroy a main battle tank. The Japanese failed to protect their soldiers. The Americans produced enough steel to destroy the enemy's soldiers with every weapon they carried. The core irony of the Pacific War lies in this collision. Japan placed its faith in the immeasurable quality of the human spirit, while the United States relied on the measurable quantity of industrial output. In the end, it was the quantity that defined the quality. The molybdenum steel core of a 50 caliber AP round was the material answer to the spiritual challenge of the Hago tank. The surviving evidence of that day on Saipan, the pocked perforated hulls of the 31 destroyed tanks, remained a silent, powerful testament to this truth. The holes, clean and round, spoke louder than any general's speech. They proved that courage, honor, and loyalty were insufficient defenses against the relentless, unforgiving force of a superior industrial economy. The tanks that were supposed to be the shield of the Japanese army became the ultimate final demonstration of their nation's technological bankruptcy, all thanks to a bullet that was never even meant to be a primary anti-tank weapon. The Japanese soldiers had expected death from anti-tank cannons. They got it instead from the humble, ubiquitous machine gun. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.